If you wanted to build a new powerhouse PC today, for gaming primarily, you'd have 2 or 3 solid combos from which to choose. First, the gaming king, the i7-8700K. Pretend that's what this is, it's in the system right now. I already reviewed the CPU in a dedicated video right here and validated the aforementioned statement. Without a doubt, this is the best gaming CPU on the market. Its overclocking potential and 6 multi-threaded cores pack a huge punch and even allow for background streaming and rendering at the same time. It's selling currently in the mid $300 range, about on par with its predecessors, and should be paired with a Z370 motherboard, which will set you back an additional $100 to $200. With 16 gigs of RAM thrown into the mix, we're looking at around $700 for the entire platform. Not too bad if you ask me. Now, as for the Coffee Lake Core i5-8600K, we get the exact same overclocking potential without hyperthreading and a $100 discount overall. The question we're going to answer in this video is a $100 discount worth it if you're going to yield similar frame rates in games? Because we all know that i5s are generally the best gaming value chips on the market, at least on Intel's side. We're going to avoid AMD for this video, but we'll revisit that topic in a separate video in the future. I struggled in deciding between running these benchmarks at stock versus overclocked, so I had each running at 4.8 gigahertz respectively, so as to include even the worst case scenario. Overclockers don't want to leave anyone behind with a terrible bin. That's not really their fault, more or less luck of the draw. I'll be testing these two platforms with a GTX 1070 Ti from EVGA. It's a well-balanced graphics card that you probably can't find anywhere right now, for a decent price that is. This For the Win edition is a 2.5 slot card and runs very quiet, as detailed in this video right here. Our clock speeds will be stock out of the box for these tests you're about to see, but you'll squeak close to a Founders Edition 1080 with a decent overclock in terms of performance. This is a great card. The same 16 gig kit of 3000 MHz DDR4 from Corsair will be used to simulate an ideal gaming config and to eliminate any potential issues with newer titles. You can find all of these components, by the way, linked in the video description. One last thing I want to point out before viewing these benchmarks is that these are strictly gaming scenarios. Obviously, any background multitasking or streaming will result in escalated CPU usage in particular, which I've covered in detail in this video right here. So I seem like I'm pointing a lot of videos, but these will help you out. I don't recommend an i5 for streaming despite the extra core bump with this generation, and I don't recommend anything below a Ryzen 5 1600 from AMD's side for the same tasks. Okay, now on to the benchmarks. The Be Quiet Dark Base 700 brings luxury and silence to the mainstream. Luxury thanks to subtle RGB integration, full case modularity, and even USB Type-C support. And silence thanks to 3 included Silent Wings 3 fans and sound damping foam all around. Click the link in this video's description for more details. We'll start first, as always, with Grand Theft Auto 5. At very high settings and no anti-aliasing or advanced graphics, we saw an admirable 122 FPS in 1080p from the i7-8700K. That dipped to 74 FPS across the lowest 1% of frames and 56 across the lowest 0.1%. These are, keep in mind, with an EVGA GTX 1070 Ti. We saw a few frame time spikes at around the 500th frame toward the beginning of the benchmark, though I wouldn't attribute them to a bottleneck on the CPU side of any kind. As for the i5-8600K, nearly comparable performance across the board, 120 FPS on average, 1% lows at 74, and 0.1% at 51. In a nutshell, gamers are better off with the i5 in this case, better value with not so much sacrificed on the performance side. PUBG was the next game on my list. With the new 391.01 drivers from NVIDIA, this game should see a noticeable boost with the 1070 Ti from our previous benchmarks, and sure enough, with the i7-8700K and medium settings, say view distance turned up to max and foliage dropped to low, we saw 130 FPS on average, 1% drop to 73, and 0.1% to 51. I want to show you this frame time graph, by the way, because we saw an enormous spike at around the 20,000th frame. I played the entire session, by the way, so I lasted pretty long. This amounts to nearly 2.5 seconds of delay between frames at one point, which is pretty abysmal. The i5 held its own as well and didn't experience the same huge spike, oddly enough, so I have absolutely no idea what caused this, but it didn't occur anywhere else during the gameplay. Still worth pointing out, though, I'm not going to completely get rid of that data just because it is an anomaly. It's something worth mentioning. The next game tested was Doom. I ran this one in DirectX 11 to ensure accurate frame rates were measured. Fraps and DirectX 12 have a love-hate relationship at this point. So average FPS for the i7 was 188, followed by 138 and 116, while the i5 scored just a bit higher, which is a bit strange, 192 on average, with 1% and 0.1% lows falling to 143 and 118 respectively. I wouldn't look too far into this though. What I think you should take away is that performance between the two is nearly identical. Both CPUs experienced a few frame time spikes here and there, but excellent work elsewhere. As for Rise of the Tomb Raider in DirectX 11, more or less a benchmark at this point because I don't really play the game, the i7 experienced a 124 FPS average, dipping to 81 and then 62 for the lowest 0.1%. The i5 saw a similar decline, 119 to 79 to 62 again. Very consistent here. You won't notice a difference in gaming if this is all you're doing. Next up is Planet Coaster, a new one I like to test because it's more or less like a Roller Coaster Tycoon Modern Edition. Excellent in-game detail and physics. Running the redundant Sandbox simulation, the i7 pulled just over 100 frames per second on average, with the lowest 0.1% dipping to just over 50 FPS. The i5 was almost the exact same story, by the way. In simulation games like these, you're more or less limited by the title's optimization. CPU usage in both runs was extremely low, and GPU usage never passed 80%, which is a signal that the game is not properly optimized. It's rather new anyway. Next up is City Skylines. I'll keep this thing short and sweet. Running the Los Santos custom map and max settings apart from depth of field, the i7 maintained a slight, albeit negligible, lead over the i5. This one's still CPU intensive, but as I've proven in this video right here, Cities best utilizes a maximum of 3 cores, which is odd, but that's what we found. So both of these CPUs can handle the program with ease. Witcher 3 is the very GPU independent game in this set of benchmarks, but I always try to throw it in for the sake of consistency. In 1080p Ultra, our frame rate jumped to 94 for the i7, 94 again for the i5, and things stayed fairly close for the rest of the way down. We did have to max out our 1070 Ti though, and that's just indicative of a very GPU intensive title. In games like these, core count and frequency are slightly less important. Lastly, Universe Sandbox 2's Earth and Many Moons simulation yields 88 FPS on average, dipping quickly once the moons collided down to 34 FPS for the lowest 1% and a mere 28 FPS for the lowest 0.1%. On the i5 8600K side, the trend starts at 82, dips to 30, and ends as low as 21. Since the CPU bottlenecks in this situation, having multi-threading on board results in a noticeable improvement overall, something we should expect, but not the general trend among AAA titles today. So my conclusion is this: apart from the minor changes in power draw, because the i7 will draw a bit more power, and efficiency, the i5 8600K is a slightly better value proposition, I think, in the long run. It's not going to be as future-proof. Obviously, that would be a reason to go for the i7. If you expect to do streaming and other things in the background, the i7 is the better bet on Intel's side. And for about 350 or so bucks, that's not too bad. The issue I want to bring up though regarding locked versus unlocked SKUs in this current market is that because we only have access to Z370 chipsets, it makes more sense to buy the unlocked SKU. So if you're considering an i5 8400, I would only purchase that if I had something other than an unlocked chipset at my disposal, because those are going to cost a bit more. So it makes sense to pair a locked SKU with a locked chipset. If you have to spend more money on the Z370 board, spend a bit more money too on the 8600K so you can extract that extra performance out of that overclock you might achieve, upwards of 5 gigahertz or so. These are pretty good overclockers. That said, between the two unlocked SKUs, the i5 and the i7, we saw negligible differences in almost every single title tested. There's something to be said about that. I would even argue that the i5 8600K is sufficient for streaming. In some of my early testing, I found that the frame rate dip really isn't all that substantial. The 6 cores are really taking on a lot, especially when overclocked. So maybe not the i5 8400 for streaming and gaming, but the 8600K might be able to handle that with a solid overclock. Again though, if you're going to spend that much on a CPU and then that much more on an AIO or a large air cooler, why not just get the i7 and put a cheaper cooler on there and then have multi-threading at your disposal, right? So it's kind of a give and take there. But for now, the i5 8600K should be all you consider if you're a true gamer at heart. 6 cores is plenty, even if not overclocked. So if the 8600K seems a bit out of reach, dropping to the 8400 should still result in some solid performance. Again though, I would wait until the non-Z370 chipsets hit the market. You can again find links to all of these CPUs down in the description, along with a few motherboards I'd recommend for each. If you like this video, be sure to let me know by giving this one a thumbs up. I appreciate it. Thumbs down for the opposite. Click subscribe button if you haven't already. Stay tuned for more content like this. This is Shahin Studio. Thanks for benchmarking with us.